So instead of focusing on a particular theorist for this section of the notes, I'm just going to take you through the trait perspective generally speaking. Trait theory is a way to describe people's personalities. Now remember, when you're looking to describe a personality, you're looking to basically describe everything about that person. I feel like to really understand the depths of personality theory, you'd need a lot more study in psychology for this. But I'll give you the highlights here. So if you're looking at a trait, it's a stable, long-lasting characteristic, something that you'd have for a long period of time, and something that you would notice in most, not necessarily all situations, but most situations. So we might notice that somebody is usually kind, or usually loyal, usually sincere, or devoted, or can usually exercise self-control. Those would be examples of traits. And they're studied through personality inventories. So basically self-reports, and I'll be giving you some examples that you can take if you want of personality tests. And obviously when you look at some of the criticisms of trait theory, it should make sense right away that people are not the same in all situations. And I might expect to see very different personality from you guys if I'm watching you play a sport than I would in my class, or if I'm watching you around your peers versus around parental figures. So if you think of Fritz Heider and his attribution theory, where he's saying consider the situation that a person is in, or remember how you put more emphasis on what you observe as being the personality instead of the situation, and that's bottom line the biggest criticism of trait theory, is that there's too much emphasis put on personality and not enough put on a person's particular situation. And so Gordon Allport, I'm not going to give you a big biographical sketch on him, although I do want to point out a couple of key interesting points. One is that he's very different from the other personality theorists that I've gone over so far, in that he had a very normal and healthy upbringing. No big trauma in his life, no scandal, nothing like that. Just pretty much healthy, normal, youngest of 4 boys situation. Gordon's brother, Floyd, had convinced him to enroll in Harvard for college. He took the entrance exam, which was required at the time, and he barely got in, and then he was doing like only okay at the beginning, and then by the end he was doing really well. He graduated with a degree in economics and philosophy, then went on to Istanbul to teach. When he decided he was going to return home, he stopped by Vienna first to visit Freud. So enter Freud again. I feel like his visit with Freud revealed something pretty cool about Allport and also something pretty cool about Freud. He went and took a train to visit Freud, and when he got to Freud's place, he was led into this red room with pictures of dreams on the wall, and he sat there with Freud in complete silence, like Freud was taking it like a therapy session. And Allport was sitting there thinking about something to say. He had no idea what he should talk about. And I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where you're like, oh God, I've got nothing to say, and you're just running through the Rolodex in your mind. And this is what Allport describes. And then finally he was like, oh, I'll just tell him about what I saw on the train. So he described this little boy who seemed to be afraid of dirt and kept asking his mother to help keep him clean. So he, little boy, afraid of dirt on the train. And Freud said to him, were you the little boy? Which I think is hysterical. One, Allport was so put off by this that Allport was like, what the heck is the problem that you immediately assumed neuroses? You immediately assumed that there was something wrong with me, that I was the boy, that I had this problem with dirt or this weird connection with my mom. You failed to look for things that are normal, which I think that's Allport's interesting observation there. Is that when Freud was given the opportunity, he looked for abnormality instead of normality. And Allport wanted to look for things that are normal. And this encounter does shape what Allport goes on to do. But I do think it's interesting on Freud's part that why, of all things to bring up, was this the particular thing that you noticed. So Freud was getting into a particular construct there. So I thought it was well played on both parts, and I've always wanted to use that line on somebody. Were you the little boy? But Allport had another encounter with somebody that you've heard of. So when he went back to get his master's and ultimately his PhD in psychology, he had an encounter with Tishner. You remember Tishner from the prologue back at the beginning of the year. Tishner with the structuralism and introspection. Well, for people working on their dissertations, Tishner had an invitation-only special group sessions where you could be invited to present your work to the group. And everybody that was invited was given 3 minutes to talk about their research, and then everybody would ask them questions afterwards. And Allport came in and did his presentation on the personality research that he was doing, and Tishner didn't like it. Tishner greeted him with absolute deafening silence after his presentation. Nobody asked him anything, nobody said anything. And then Tishner went and talked to his advisor and was like, why would you let him work on something so absurd as personality? And his advisor talked to Allport and said, what do you care what he thinks? So he went on to study personality. But that's not the only reason we've talked about Allport. We talked about him, if you remember, in the social psych unit with the nature of prejudice. So Allport is going to come up with a trait theory. First thing, he opposes psychoanalysis in large part because of his encounter with Freud. He also opposed behaviorism, and he distrusted science. He felt like it was too restrictive. It's like he didn't want to ignore the scientific method, but he didn't want to be restricted by it either. I think part of the issue was that Allport saw personality development as being dynamic, that nothing ever is, it's only ever becoming something. So in looking at traits, you have your temperament, your emotional reactivity that you're born with, your character, which is what you learn from your environment along the way, and then the type. So you might be like a neat type. And no two people will have the same pattern of traits. So if two people were to react to a stranger, one might react to the same stranger suspiciously and the other with interest, because their traits are different despite the fact that their environmental cues were the same. Thus, they'll have different responses. Another thing is that Allport said that traits are not the same thing as habits, and they're not the same thing as attitudes. So a habit is more specific than a trait. So you might have like a cleanliness trait which causes you to brush your teeth and clean your room. So those are your habits that are based off of your trait. Traits are also not attitudes because attitudes imply some level of evaluation, either for or against something. And for the completely simplified AP version of Allport's trait theory, here are the 3 points that you need. First, the cardinal trait. Very few people have cardinal traits. These are traits that influence almost everything that a person does. So it's pervasive. It's available in almost all situations. People could end up being famous for them. You would imagine that most people, like I said before, you're different in front of your teachers than you are in front of your parents, in front of your friends, that sort of thing. If you have a cardinal trait, then you're the same in all situations. Now, I could think of a few people that might be that way, but if I look sort of historically, maybe Martin Luther, maybe Jesus, maybe Freud, Gandhi, maybe these are all people that would have had cardinal traits because they show up in all situations. Hitler would be another example. So I don't want any evaluation there. It's not good nor bad to have a cardinal trait. It's just that it's so pervasive. It shows up in everything you do. The next level would be the central traits, and people have a few of these, like 5 to 10 central traits. You could be competitive, generous, independent, arrogant, fearful. These would be part of your core personality, and we have about 5 to 10 of those according to Allport. As for the secondary traits, you could have a lot of those. They don't affect your behavior as much. So preferences for, say, a particular style of clothing, music. Your secondary traits are observable, and therefore your central traits are inferred based on your secondary traits or dispositions. All in all, Allport's theory, it's almost too big. So he started out with like 18,000 different words that he found in the dictionary to describe human personality. He took the synonyms out and, ultimately got the list down to 4,500 and then about 200. But either way, his list of traits ended up being, I think, a little bit too big to be really useful. And then Raymond Cattell, also very simplified here. I want to point out a couple of intersections along the way. We talked about Cattell already in the intelligence unit because he worked with Charles Spearman. Remember Spearman, who came up with the G for general intelligence? He thought that intelligence was a single factor. Remember that Cattell agreed with Spearman that yes, intelligence is a single factor, but it can be broken down into fluid and crystallized intelligence. Fluid decreases with age, like reaction time, that sort of thing, and crystallized intelligence should increase with age, like your general fund of knowledge. He also worked with Thorndike, and I hope you remember Thorndike. Thorndike from the behaviorism unit. He was the person who kind of was the basis for operant conditioning. Skinner really gets credit for that, but it was Thorndike's theories that Skinner was working with. Thorndike, that one big thing you need to know about him, the law of effect, that rewarded behavior is more likely to recur. That's Thorndike. And then he's going to intersect with Allport at Harvard University and work on personality theory there. And once again, key concepts, very simplified here. You have his surface traits. These are the things that lie on the surface of personality. These traits can be inferred from observations of behavior, something like stubbornness, emotionality, carelessness. But since most of these traits occur in conjunction with other traits, there must be a deeper level of personality. The source traits are the fundamental dimensions of human personality. They can't be observed. They must be inferred from surface traits. The source traits, these are at your deep level, would be things like being reserved, outgoing, intelligent, dominant, practical, trusting. And in order to determine these source traits, he would use factor analysis. Again, if you remember, Spearman that came up with the generalized intelligence, general intelligence, G, intelligence is a single factor because he used factor analysis to determine statistical clusters, that he could predict areas on certain tests by using how well you did on other areas. And Cattell would use factor analysis to identify what the source traits were from surface traits. Cattell developed the 16 personality factors, and there's a 16 personality factor questionnaire that people can do, and the 16 factors are listed here: warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness. You can read on with that. And he would give questions, and you'd come up with a personality factor profile, identifying your traits. So if you look at the example here, you see in blue, you have airline pilots compared to, in red, writers. If you look at the scale, on one side, reserved, unsocial, the other side, outgoing, sociable, less intelligent, concrete, more intelligent, abstract, affected by feelings, emotionally stable, submissive, humble versus dominant or assertive, and down you go. And he got these like personality profiles. And when you're comparing airline pilots to writers, what Cattell would have pulled from this is that pilots are more controlled, more relaxed, and more self-assured than writers. And writers tend to be more sensitive than airline pilots. Hans Eysenck was a German psychologist who researched the genetically influenced dimensions of personality, also a trait theorist. The way to really remember what Eysenck did is just by using the word pen. So psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. When you're looking at extroversion, know that it's also compared to introversion. Just as a point, again, when we look at the words psychotic and neurotic, neurotic is really an outdated term in terms of the DSM, just not in terms of personality theory. And psychoticism, we mean that as a breakdown of thought. Here it's meant something entirely different than the way we would use it in terms of diagnosing somebody. So somebody who is low in psychoticism, according to Eysenck, would be warm, sensitive, concerned about others. Someone high in psychoticism would be cold, antisocial, hostile, insensitive, unconcerned about others. For extroversion, or the introversion-extroversion scale, the degree to which a person directs their energies inward towards themselves, like an introvert, or outward towards other, like an extrovert. So an introvert would be more solitary in their pursuits, more reserved, less social. An extrovert would be more outgoing, more overtly friendly, more people-oriented. And then neuroticism is your emotional stability versus your emotional instability. So somebody who's emotionally unstable would be more tense, more anxious, worrisome, restless, moody. Lower in neuroticism, they'd be more relaxed, more calm, stable, even tempered. So if we break down Eysenck's theory, you want to look at it as a continuum, really, between being unstable and stable, and then the continuum going in the other direction from introverted to extroverted. So if your personality type is more in the introverted, unstable, these are the characteristics: moody, anxious, rigid, sober, pessimistic, reserved, unsociable, quiet. If you fall in the introverted, stable category, you're more passive, careful, thoughtful, peaceful, controlled, reliable, even-tempered, and calm. In the stable, extroverted category, you'd be more sociable, outgoing, talkative, responsive, easygoing, lively, carefree, and more of a leader. And more unstable but extroverted, you'd be touchy, restless, aggressive, excitable, changeable, impulsive, optimistic, and active. And once again, very simplified, the 5-factor model, or the Big Five theory. This is the most popular trait theory. Essential building blocks of personality are described in 5 basic personality dimensions. They're described somewhat differently among researchers, but are found in cross-cultural studies. Research will show them to be stable and consistent over time, over different situations. And human behavior is the result of interaction between traits and situations, according to this theory. Okay, so the best way to remember this is with the mnemonic OCEAN. And this one shows up all the time on the AP exam, particularly in the short answer, which is what you guys are getting this year. And they often ask something like this, like, according to the 5-factor model of personality, how does conscientiousness apply to this scenario? Or how does agreeableness apply to this scenario? And the number one mistake I see people making is they're like, oh, 5-factor, that's OCEAN. And then they start describing openness instead of conscientiousness, like was asked, or agreeableness that was asked. So make sure you read the question carefully, because they usually highlight just one aspect of this. So openness, how open you are to new experiences and learning. Conscientiousness, the degree to which one is responsible, hardworking, reliable, dependable. Extroversion, how outgoing, expressive, active, and social are you. Agreeable, how honest, considerate, likable, and tolerant are you. And neuroticism, how anxious, self-conscious, or impulsive are you. So the left here is where you're going to be more open, and on the right, less open. So you're more open if you're imaginative, you have a preference for variety, and you're more independent. You're less open if you're practical, you have a preference for routine, or you're more conforming. For extroversion, once again, more extroverted on the left, so more sociable, fun-loving, and affectionate as compared to retiring, sober, and reserved. For agreeable, here you go. You're more agreeable if you're soft-hearted, trusting, and helpful as compared to ruthless, suspicious, and uncooperative. You're more emotionally stable if you're calm, secure, and self-satisfied as opposed to anxious, insecure, or self-pitying. And you are more conscientious if you're organized, careful, and disciplined as compared to disorganized, careless, and impulsive.